when it comes to healing, there's this really great quote by Pope Benedict XVI, right? And so it basically goes like this. Healing is an essential part of the apostolic mission, and if understood correctly, it contains the fullness of our redemption. Now, when you hear that particular quote, obviously it's kind of short and pithy, but if you think about it, there's a lot to it. And so the whole idea is that when it comes to the pilgrim journey, when it comes to bearing our cross, we're not called to simply grit our teeth and bear it in terms of bearing our cross with a stance of self-pity, but instead we're called to grow and transform and enter more fully into the fullness of the person that God calls us to be. We're not called to simply carry our cross in circles, but instead we're called to recognize that the cross is meant to be the primary means of our transformation in Christ. Through the cross, we're meant to change and stretch and transform to become fully human and therefore fully alive. To further illustrate this point, I want to share with you an example from the Howard Stern show, actually. And this involves an episode where the actor Ben Affleck was being interviewed about his struggles and recovery from alcoholism. And so at the very outset of the interview, Ben Affleck talked about how we as human beings, as people, we tend to deal recurringly with the notion of compulsion. And he named various forms of compulsive behavior. Not just alcohol, but overeating, shopping, gambling, that type of thing. And the whole idea was that a lot of times we turn to compulsion to numb our pain, as if pain, the experience of pain, is the worst possible evil we could ever experience. And then he went on to talk about his early experiences with such programs as Alcoholics Anonymous, right? And so he was very open and honest about the fact that initially when he went to these meetings, he was annoyed by these old guys who would say, "I'm a grateful alcoholic, and now I feel no compulsion to drink." And in response, what he was saying, at least internally, was, why are you grateful? You're grateful because you ruined your life? That doesn't make sense. And on top of that, you don't feel like you want to drink, then what are you doing here? Like, I'm really struggling. I want to drink. And so let's talk about that. But then eventually he came to the conclusion, funny enough, that in his own words, the real solution to addiction is suffering. And so the way he phrases it is that eventually you got to suffer enough to realize that, no, I'm done, right? And in his case, it involved his kids, right? And so eventually he came to the point where he realized that his addiction, his compulsive behavior, was going to result in the loss of his kids. And the way he describes it, that was the worst day of his life, but at the same time, it gave him freedom from his addiction. And then to punctuate his story, he kind of concludes by saying, well, now I'm one of those annoying guys at these meetings who says, yeah, I'm grateful. I'm grateful for this painful experience because it helped me to become a better human being, it helped me become a better father, and now I really have no compulsion to drink whatsoever. Now, obviously, in bringing up this particular example, I'm not trying to downplay the difficulty of overcoming any sort of addiction or compulsion. But at the same time, it is to kind of highlight that suffering is not the worst kind of evil, but instead we're called to recognize always that there's something greater than suffering. We're called to do better. We're called to become more. And more to the point, we're called to recognize that suffering can often be the means by which this transformation occurs, to become, again, a person of greater substance and character. Okay, one final example, and I'll kind of end with this. And this involves the testimony of Chris Stefanik, this really popular Catholic speaker, and his wife, Natalie. And so as a matter of background, Natalie, back in the day when she was a younger woman, she was abused, as a result of which she struggled enormously with physical intimacy in her marriage with her husband, Chris. And so as a result, she went to therapy for years. But then Chris, as you might expect, also struggled. And so, for example, he struggled mightily with this recurring temptation to look at his wife, Natalie, as the problem, even though she was obviously a victim of past trauma. And on top of that, because of Natalie's ongoing psychological and emotional difficulties, Chris, for months at a time, was forced to be a celibate in the context of marriage. And obviously, as a result, there was the recurring temptation to go the way of sexual sin, whether we're talking about pornography or masturbation or whatever the case may be. But then over time, with prayer, with effort, and obviously with the grace of God, Chris eventually came to a place of healing and restoration. And so, for example, he came to really identify with the Sacred Heart of Jesus. And so just to reflect on the image of the Sacred Heart, right? So it's bleeding, it's pierced, it's crowned with thorns, but at the same time, it's always exposed. And eventually, through that image, through that devotion to the Sacred Heart, Chris eventually came to realize that I'm not called to back away from the cross. I'm not called to self-medicate to numb my pain. But instead, I'm called to recognize that the cross is meant to be the very means by which I'm called to change and stretch and transform to become a person of love, to look more like Christ. And on top of that, this whole experience helped him to reconfigure his prior notion of marriage. And so he realized in retrospect that for the longest time, his image of the situation was like, look, Natalie, my wife, you need to change in order to make me feel better about myself. in order for you to take care of me. But then he realized that's the way that a child looks at one's relationship, right? As opposed to recognizing that, my wife is my wife as opposed to my mom. And so eventually he came to realize, not just theoretically, but experientially, that marriage truly is meant to be an exchange of persons. And so I'm not called to be a child looking for my wife to take care of me. I'm called to lay down my life out of love for my wife, to love her unconditionally through thick and thin. And then finally, Chris identified the power of gratitude. And he highlighted in particular the power of gratitude to push away the darkness. And so again, for the longest time, he looked at Natalie fundamentally as a problem. Why won't you be fixed like yesterday, such that you might make me feel better about myself? But eventually he came to see her through the lens of gratitude. Here's this person, here's my wife, here's this woman that I love, who is, in his own words, walking through minefields for me, for us, for the sake of our marriage. And that provoked in him gratitude. And what's more, that's the thing that brought about healing in Natalie. Because for the longest time, she struggled enormously with a deep sense of shame. Because I've been unloved by people who should have loved me back in the day, therefore I must be unlovable. But now here's my husband who is loving me in spite of my woundedness, in spite of my shame. And so therefore perhaps I can take a chance to believe that I can be loved, that I am in fact lovable. And that in fact led to healing and restoration. And what's more, this shared struggle, this journey with the cross and through the cross eventually helped to benefit their own children in a really beautiful sort of way. And so as Natalie tells a story, when she first shared the story of her own wounded past and subsequent recovery with her eldest daughter, the daughter at first was really sad. But then Natalie responded by saying to her daughter, look, don't cry, don't mourn for me, but instead rejoice. Rejoice with me. I am the living manifestation of God's glory, of his redeeming love. So again, rejoice with me and share in God's glory. Now, obviously, I love that story, but I gotta tell you, friends, that particular story can also become our story. I mean, all of us have wounds. All of us are called to share in the one redeeming cross of Christ in our own particular and unique sort of ways. But the secret to achieving this deep sense of transformation on a heart level, requires that we not be afraid of the cross, but instead we lean into it. Not with a sense of self-pity or despondency or despair, but with a sense of, this is the very means by which God calls me to be great. The cross will transform me to become a person of tremendous love, tremendous character. And when that happens, I'm called to give witness to God's glory. Look at what God has done for me, and the invitation implicitly is that he could do the same thing for you. And may God bless you all.